computer. I think that's all about it. I will share the screen. There we are. I'm getting the hang of this, aren't I? So what we've got now is, come on, there we are. I'm not a taxonomist, so I can't tell you what plants are called, but I can tell you how they work. And this is what it's about. The last two lessons were on plant, the reproduction, and so on. This one is more about the actual physical part of the plant, of the plants and different parts of them. So if you had a look at the notes, you would have seen basically what it's about. So we have, the plant has got transport system, and these are really, really important. So they need to have water, they need to have the minerals, and then once they have water and minerals, they can produce everything that they need. They'll produce, of course, glucose, and glucose will make cellulose. They will produce all the proteins they need from that, and the fats, of course, because from once you've got the carbohydrates, you can make fats, or if you're a plant, of course. But you also have these things called leaves and flowers and fruit, and they have to have the plant has to have access to them and from them. So it's a fairly, on the surface, it looks like it's a fairly basic system, but it's quite complex. And so the idea is to make sure that the sugars, minerals, the vitamins that the plant actually makes, everything that it makes are transported to where they're needed. So from the leaves to the roots, where they're stored, and in fact, they need the energy in the roots to be able to absorb the minerals, and water just comes in passively, so there's no issue there. And of course, the flowers need all the nutrients that they can get, and the fruit nothing will happen if you can't access it. Now, the actual let's say tubes, so the system of moving the material around the plant, there are two types of plants, and plants that have these vessels, these two types, and one of them you can see is called the xylem. They're called, these plants, like the trees and the shrubs and everything that you can see around the place that is more than above ground level, they're called tracheophytes. Now, if you remember, we've talked about the word tracheo before, it just means tube, and in our throat, we have a tube called the trachea, same thing, and phytes are plants. So these are plants with tubes. And so the xylem, and they have many, many tubes. They were living once, but the nucleus, everything disappears, and they form these very long tubes, and we'll get to later. And there's another group called phloem, and these are made of living cells, and they grow end to end, but they don't actually have a nucleus either, but they have these special cells that live next to them, which look after them. So someone's given them the appropriate name of companion cells. And then we have another group of cells. They're not tubes, but these are cells called cambium cells, which live between the two groups of cells. And well, the word is differentiate. They actually produce xylem. As a plant grows, you need more of xylem and you need more of phloem. And that keeps the whole system going. And the cambium have nuclei, and they're just normal cells, but they're able to differentiate, become one or the other. So if you just take I remember we talked about dicotyledons and monocotyledons and how they're different. They have different types of leaves, different types of flowers, and in fact, the stem looks different. So here we have a drawing of a dicotyledon, of a dicot stem, and each one of these is called a vascular bundle. So here's a diagram of it, just so you have an idea. In the inside, the brown one is called the xylem, which I mentioned, and that transports water and minerals from the ground up as far as the tree is. The red one is the phloem, which transfers nutrients around the plant. So it moves both directions. And then you've got the cambium in the middle, which can become either of those. Okay, just to give you an idea of how it works. I'll mention here this word pith is the center of the stem, of the trunk, if you like, and that's where these vascular bundles have been, once have been, and that's sort of the center of a tree. And as the tree grows, these vascular bundles keep moving out towards the edge. So as the edge gets bigger, we move out, and then the rest of the tree is just it's pith. They're not necessarily living, but they're there. It's for support. I think that's all I need to tell you there. If you remember, we're talking about the dicotyledons and the monocotyledons. Just to remind you, they have the pollen grains. They're a little bit different. The seeds, they have dicotyledons, and the cotyledons are the first leaves. So they have two. The monocots have one. The flowers in 4s and 5s, and in the monocots have 3. These are variegated. They have veins which are not straight, and these are parallel veins. Now, today we're talking about the vascular bundles, and if you have a look, they're quite different. Here, they're in the circle like the previous slide, the drawings. Here, they're all over the place. They're quite different. Even the roots are different. They have a taproot, and then they have other roots of that. And whereas in the monocots, you have the fibrous root. So if you pull out a weed, this is what you see. If you pull out a tree, that's what you see. Or even a shrub, a rose bush, whatever. It's straight down. Okay, so xylem from the Greek xylon, it basically means wood. It's right through the plant, and its main function is to transport water. And that process of water transportation is called transpiration. And it transports nutrients and minerals from the soil, and it also provides the strength. And it's very woody. The xylem is woody. It's originally, of course, made of cells, and when the cells die back and the cell walls have become quite woody, they also open up at each end, so they become continuous tubes. So, but they only go in one direction, and they reinforce themselves. So this is a very high magnification photo, and this is what they look like. They're tubes, continuous tubes. And while and by the way, if you think of a tube with water, the water becomes quite heavy. And if you've got a very high tree, 100 meters, 120 meters, the amount of water that's being carried from the roots up is quite heavy. So these tubes can't be too big, or they couldn't handle the water, the weight of the water. So it's divided up amongst the much smaller ovaries. The phloem, by the way, you see here, they're totally different. They're living, these are the companion cells next door here, and they're the cambium, the living cells, which differentiate. So as I said, they're non-living, and we have this thing called lignin. It's the glue that holds them together, and the whole thing's being lignified, and that's what becomes wood. Now, I should mention that one of the biggest problems with paper making, the production of paper, is getting rid of the lignin, because they use wood chips to make paper. They've got to separate the fibers, but and then they end up with this, it's black, it's actually a black glue, and they have this black goo that comes out. And I've seen this. My father used to work for Smorgan's paper mills, and I went through the factory a few times. And this, even then, 40 odd years ago, whenever it was, they were having big problems with this lignin. And I can't remember how they solve the problem or what they do with it. But, they do separate them. Now, water has two properties besides quenching our thirst. Water itself has a property of cohesion and a property of adhesion. And if it didn't have both of these properties, none of this could happen. So let's go through it. Cohesion is when the molecules of water actually attract each other. So if you look at a molecule of water, you have the oxygen and two hydrogens. Now, because oxygen is a fairly, has a high electronegativity, it means it attracts electrons more than hydrogen does. The electrons are closer to the oxygen. So the oxygen ends up with an overall negative charge. And because the hydrogen with the proton, which is positive, it shares the electron, but the electron spends more time around the oxygen, it has a little negative. I don't know if you can see, there's a little squiggle there with a positive. It's the Greek letter delta. It just means it's a little positive and the oxygen is a little negative. So the oxygen and the hydrogen attract each other. And that attraction is an electrical attraction. It's called a hydrogen bond. It's a weak bond, a very weak bond. But when you've got lots of them, it's good. So if you look at this structure, it's sort of a pyramidal structure. Anyway, I won't go into the chemistry much any more than that. So cohesion is when the water attracts itself to itself. Adhesion is when it attracts itself to anything else it touches. So if you have a glass of water and you finish drinking it, glass of water, the actual glass is still wet because the water sticks, it adheres to it. Okay, so the xylem, the water is just a simple diagram. It's, in fact, for looking at the label of the diagram, it's quite an old diagram, but it's perfect for what I need to tell you. So they have these long, continuous streams of columns of water. Now, sometimes you get air breaks in them. Now, if you look at the arrows here, the little pits in the walls. So as the water is used up at the top for photosynthesis and other general metabolic reasons, and also it loses water through the stomata into the atmosphere. So there's a continuous movement of water. And sometimes, especially in this, as the tubes are very narrow, you get the water separating and you get an air bubble. Now, once you've got an air bubble, the water can't get past it. So, but it keeps going through these pits. So it bypasses it, and eventually the air gets taken up by the water and disappears, and the whole thing just keeps on going. Okay, so it's a mechanism for which uses physical properties of water. Now, each one of these that I showed you before, the diagram where you have the bundle of the xylem and the phloem and the cambium, and that's called the vascular bundle. It's a bundle of vessels. So this is a very, very good diagram of a dicot leaf structure. Now, so there are layers. So you've got the upper and lower epidermis. You've got two different layers in here. Now, the palisade, it's called a palisade. The palisade is a name for columns. And sometimes you see it written as columnar epithelium. So they look like columns. Each green dot is a chloroplast that undergoes photosynthesis. Down the bottom bit is called spongy parenchyma. It used to be called a spongy mesophyll, but the spongy bit comes from the air gaps. You can see here, big air gaps. So here's a stoma, which allows air to move in and out, or carbon dioxide in, oxygen out, and while it's open, the water vapor leaves as well. Under normal conditions, it's not a problem. Under arid conditions, it's a major problem. And then you've got your vascular bundles here, the xylem and the phloem. So this is a very good indication of what it's like. Each of these cells here and has the chloroplasts, and the whole system produces glucose. That's the purpose of photosynthesis, and we'll get to that in a second. Now, let's look at the phloem. The phloem, I don't know how to pronounce. I don't speak Greek, but phlos, I don't know, but it means bark, and it moves nutrients both directions and carries sugars from the leaves to the roots. Now, I mentioned transpiration before, where it carries water from the roots up to the leaves. Translocation could be in both directions, and it's moving sugars. And there's no energy required. It's an amazing system now, which I'll tell you about very shortly. So not only does it carry the sugars, mostly glucose, which is mostly sap, but it's different sorts of sugars depending on the plant. It also carries hormones, it carries nutrients, and protein, whatever is required further down. And the plant signals itself. Chemical signals move up and down depending on what's required and how quickly it's required. And so I mentioned that the phloem cells are living, and they're kept and they produce these sieve tubes, and they are perforated, so things move through these sieve plates. Now, which I showed you before, but I'll show you again. The companion cells. Now, I mentioned before that phloem cells do not have a nucleus because it wouldn't fit in. It just wouldn't allow the movement to happen. So they have developed these companion cells, or nurse cells, which we have in animals. And what they do, they keep the phloem cells alive by looking after its needs. And each phloem cell has got its own companion cell. So here's a diagram of it. So here we have a phloem cell. Here's the sieve plates along there. Now, these ones in the yellow, they have a nucleus. So they are living and keep these guys alive. And the word parenchyma is basically refers to the layer. So the main function of this parenchyma, the phloem, is to store food. Sorry, just going back here. The outside, I should mention, the outside layer stores food to feed these guys here. So it stores food and other things like resins and latex, mucilage. So when you've got a rubber tree and they tap the rubber, they tap the tree by cutting it, and then from these parenchyma cells or layers, you get the flow of latex, various other things, resins. Pine trees produce these resins, and also part of the transportation process. Now, phloem also has a thing called sclerenchyma, excuse me, sclerenchyma cells, and they support it mechanically. So here's another diagram, the same idea again, but just to reinforce it. So we have the xylem, the cambium, and the phloem. So it shows you the relationship here. Now, with translocation, they said no energy is required. So this is the top of this plant, and this is the bottom of the plant. The top of the plant makes the sugars, and with respect to the flow of water, which we call osmosis, it requires something to stimulate it. So if you've got water nearby, this cell, for example, full of sugar, glucose, fructose, sucrose, whatever it might be, water is attracted. Now that attraction of water flowing into here builds up a pressure. So this pressure pushes everything down. And then once it reaches the roots, then it's actively, the sugars are taken out and actively move into these cells and stored there. Now, the sucrose, or whichever sugar it is an osmotically active molecule, and you can't have that in the root. Otherwise, it will really mess things up. So what they do to convert the sugars to starch. Now, starch is a very large molecule and does not produce an osmotic pressure, and that's sitting there as a food source. And we have exactly, animals, us, have exactly the same process. We have glucose stored in the liver and in muscles, but it can't be stored as glucose because of the osmotic pressure. If you have liver cells just with glucose in them, water will just flow in and burst those cells, and you'll end up with no liver. So the glucose that we store in muscles and in the liver are converted to glycogen, which is like starch, a very, very, very large molecule, slightly different sequence of sugars, but it's not active osmotically at all. So then, from here, the water goes back into the xylem, transpires up, and then it goes around and round. And that's how things move around in the system. Okay, now that's what I just said. Just is another diagram to show you where the phloem is under the bark. So you've got your phloem, you've got your xylem, and then you've got your cambium in there. The cambium. Anyway, so the phloem itself, don't forget these are living cells. It contains the sap, and which can be extracted. So things like latex and maple syrup is another one I didn't mention before. Now, ring bark in a tree produces a barrier. So if you ring bark, you take a section, it could only be a few centimeters deep in height, but then the phloem, which is on just under the bark, then the phloem can't flow, and the roots don't get any nutrients that have come down from the leaves. So then the roots are dead. And once they're dead, even though water will keep on flowing, it will not take up any minerals. And eventually the tree dies. And how that was found out, I have no idea. But what we've got here is an indication of how close it is to the Shillita bark, and it's just very, very close to it. Here's another diagram. So here's if you look at here, the bark itself includes the living phloem of the bark, and then there's this what's called a cork. It's the bark itself, which is quite soft, and it protects the phloem. The green one, the cambium, and then you've got what I call the sapwood, which is the xylem, and then you've got the heartwood, which used to be the xylem. Now, as the tree grows up and out, this heartwood gets bigger, and new xylem and new phloem are produced, and it's moving out. Okay, so the cambium is what produces the cells that can differentiate, that can produce different things. And they can differentiate to xylem, they can differentiate into phloem. So it's a very good operational system, and it works. So how do we store the nutrients that we produce? How does the tree produce, the plant produce, store and what it produces? So most of it is stored in the roots. Some of them store them like the cactus in their stems. And the leaves produce glucose through photosynthesis. And this is the general formula for it. I've left all the enzymes out. That's not important. The important thing here is that carbon dioxide from the air and water from the ground combines in here with light and chlorophyll. The green, it's usually green, but not always. Could be red, could be yellow, to produce glucose and oxygen. So it needs the light, and that's why it's called photosynthesis. Photo in Greek means light, and and you can't store glucose as glucose because of the great osmotic pressure that it produces. Now, I've talked about osmotic pressure and give examples and so on in past talks. I'm not sure if you want me to re-explain that, but there is a chemical pressure that's produced. Okay, so again, starch is what's left. It just, the glucose dissolves in water, starch doesn't. So if it doesn't dissolve in water, the water can't move across. Nothing there to attract the water. Okay, now let's look at it from the gross to the microscopic. This is a really good diagram of what a plant cell looks like. Well, this is the plant cell here, one of the, and then it's got neighbors, of course. So within the system, you've any plant, you've got chloroplasts. Sorry, not any plant. Cells that undergo photosynthesis, which happens in the chloroplasts. It has mitochondria. It has Golgi, which is part of the protein-producing system. The nucleus, which is part of it, as part of the protein-producing system as well. And these are ribosomes. I'm not going to go there today. These things, plasmodesmata, they're like little tubes, little channels that allows the cells to communicate with each other. So signals, chemical signals, move between the cells quite easily. So cellulose allows water to move in and out. And by the way, I should mention that cellulose is 100% pure glucose, but like starch, it's made of glucose, but in a different sequence of different structure, the way the glucose molecules are attached. So we, as I said, starch is in plants, glycogen is in animals, and the whole reason for the starch and the glycogen is to prevent the osmotic pressure from destroying the cells. And even though they're basically the same, they're structured with glucose molecules is different. Now, I should mention here, the cellulose allows water to enter but not burst. It's very, very tough. So this is very important. This word turgid. Turgid means that the plant is very firm, very hard, and it just won't burst. But you know, so sometimes you have a pot plant, you forget to water, and it droops. And then you fill it up with water, and you add water to it, and then it comes good. If you lose water out of this, it becomes quite flaccid, and the droop comes in. By adding water, it'll just firm up and then look as it should be. So the turgidity is important. Animal cells can't do this because we don't have a cell wall. We have a cell membrane, which they also have to, where is it here? The plasma membrane, it's a cell membrane between what's inside the cell and the cell wall. Animals don't have the wall part. So if we get a little bit too much water coming into a cell, the cell will burst in animals, not in plants. In plants, it just becomes hard. So if you take an apple and bite into it and get this wonderful crunch, or if you're a celery eater and you take a bite out of celery and you get this crunch, it's because of this high turgidity. There's a huge amount of water in there. If you ever find an old piece of celery or even an old carrot at the back of the fridge you forgot about, and it's all floppy. I don't know if you know, a fridge is 0% humidity. So that's why you have to put things into containers, otherwise they dry out. So if you take the old piece of celery or carrot and you put it into a bowl of water, just tap water, the water will flow in due to osmosis and become turgid again. You can eat it, cook with it, whatever you want. You don't throw it away. Nothing wrong with it, just lack of water. Now, these cells are held together, as I mentioned before, with this glue, the lignin. And together with these, the cellulose, the turgidity, the lignin, you get plants which can grow 100 meters, more 120 meters high. So the xylem cells basically look like this, and they're held together. Part of the lignin is part of the system here. So we have enough sort of the chemicals, what the lignin looks like, the molecule, and there's the cellulose in a particular structure. So if you've got your stem here, take a section of that, the xylem, and that's what an individual xylem tube or xylem cell looks like. So here we have probably, I don't know, I think this is one of my photos. I can't remember where from. It's beautiful gums, but they're all very tall. And if one falls over, if someone cuts one down, there's no way you can lift it. They're very, very heavy. They're solid things, and the xylem and the phloem keep them going. It sounds simple, but it's a bit more complicated. So let's go back to the leaf structure. So here we have a vascular bundle, and you can see a xylem. There the palisade, and mesophyll, the spongy mesophyll, and so on. Now under here, usually on the underside, we have these stomata, which is the plural of stoma. And the matter of these two cells, guard cells, which they guard. Now, they are here next to this spongy mesophyll, which is full of air. And air is able to move in, air in the form of, well, within the air, we have carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide is used with the water, which comes down here with the xylem, and sunshine, you get chlorophyll, glucose being formed with the chlorophyll. So again, we'll have a look at the guard cells. Now, it's one stoma, plural stomata. It's really just a pore here. And this is what they look like. They're generally on the lower surface, away from the sunlight. Some plants have them on both surfaces. Plants like that have stems that photosynthesize, like cacti, for example, they have their stomata in the stems, and when they're open, and this one, for example, in the bottom left, is partially open, the gases move in and out. So we need the carbon dioxide, which goes in through that. The oxygen leaves. And by the way, the plant doesn't make oxygen for us. It makes the oxygen for its own systems, its own metabolic processes. but it also produces more than it needs. And because of that, we are able to survive. And so the stoma, which is the guard, if you like, is made up of two special cells. It's got these two special cells are called guard cells, and they regulate the size of the opening. So how much gas and water vapor and everything just moves through it is controlled by the plant. So they're basically open during the day, and it undergoes photosynthesis. It needs the carbon dioxide, so it's going to be open, but it also loses water vapor and it loses quite a bit of the oxygen. Now, the biggest problem a plant has, besides insect or animals eating it, the biggest problem is water loss. And in rainforest, no issue at all. In Australia, where it's a fairly temperate area, it really doesn't have a problem. But in arid areas like deserts, it's a major problem, major problem. So they only open at dawn, and they close at dusk, but depends on what part of the world they live in. And again, the word osmosis rears its head, and it works through that process. And at dawn, when it opens up, a small amount of the starch that's in the cell is converted to glucose. That attracts water, and through osmotic pressure, the water moves in through these into the guard cells themselves. Now, the walls of the guard cells the walls are not evenly thick. The inside surfaces, you saw them, they're like this. The inside surface is thicker than the outer surface. And when the water flows in and the pressure inside the guard cells increases, the thinner wall moves more, so you get this opening. And at dusk, when light almost disappears, it withdraws any glucose, and the water leaves, and the guard cells close. The problem in arid areas is that they must not, they cannot, should not have produced undergo photosynthesis during the day, because as soon as the stomata open, the air on the outside is so dry, any water that's in the leaves will just shoot out. So during the day, they're closed. During the night, they're closed, but they open at dawn and they open at dusk. And they very quickly produce some glucose, and then they close up. So they keep enough glucose going for them to until they can keep them going until the next event, which will be at dusk. So there's a little bit of light. They have chlorophyll that is sensitive to that light, and that can produce some. So by being closed during the heat of the day, they just try and minimize the water loss. And under most conditions, the worst problem a plant has is wind. When the wind blows, it actually moves the water away from the leaf. And it just loses a lot of water through the wind. It really is terrible. Here's a diagram the inside surface here is thicker than the outer surface. So this is a guard cell. When water moves in, it becomes turgid, and the stoma is just this hole, it's a pore. When the water is removed at dusk, then it closes, and there's no more movement through the stomata. Here's a lovely, I found this photo, two stomata. One's partly open and the other one hasn't. I don't know what time of the day this would be, but the other one's closed and this one's open. Now, with respect to photosynthesis, we require the sun, we require water from the soil, we require chlorophyll, and we require carbon dioxide, carbon and 2 oxygens, carbon dioxide. And together, it produces its own food. Now, an organism that produces its own food is called an autotroph. Auto means self-feeder, the troph. And so again, water, carbon dioxide with light and chlorophyll, you get the glucose, you get the oxygen. And then the glucose has to be converted and stored as starch. And then the starch is broken down to glucose if required or whatever is needed, but it's starch is the way it's kept. And here's a lovely diagram with a bit more detail. So carbon dioxide and water with light and chlorophyll and a couple of other enzymes. I'm not going too much into the chemistry. It gives you this molecule, which is the molecule for glucose. It's also the same number of atoms for fructose. It just said the structure is a little different. It produces also oxygen and the leftover water. It had 12. Sometimes you'll see this equation with a 6 here and without the 6 here. So this is more correct, but at school up to about year 11, you'd say 6 waters. In year 12, they need to be a bit more accurate. So this is the correct equation. Now, glucose is used to produce everything that the plant needs, and together with the oxygen it needs for metabolism, it doesn't need much else. So when I don't know how many millions of years ago now, probably a couple of billion, where in water where we had very simple plant life, algae, for example, and they were starting to produce oxygen. There could be no animals, no oxygen producing, no organism that can't make their own oxygen survive. Once there was enough oxygen in the air, then evolution could start producing or developing organisms that can use like oxygen from the air rather than producing it themselves. So oxygen had to be in the air first. Now, we're talking millions and millions of years. Imagine how many plants, for how long to be able to produce enough oxygen so we can use it. Now, the air under normal conditions at sea level is 21% oxygen. So 21% of the air that around us is oxygen, and it all comes from plants. I've got to throw that in.
Thank you, Ruben. I've just sent you a question on that.
Oh, I didn't get. Oh, I see. Hang on. Oh, there it is. Are plants responsible? Oh, you did. Yes. I answered it before without seeing it. Are you okay with that, Peter?
Thank you.
Okay, good. All right. So this is just something for you to think about. It just boggles the mind of how much and how long it takes to fill a fifth of the Earth's atmosphere with the oxygen so we could breathe it. Now, because plants produce their own food, as we see what they're called autotrophs, we who cannot produce our own food are called heterotrophs. Heterotrophs. Another word for you. It just means other feeding. Now, the photosynthesis is fascinating. It happens in these things called chloroplasts. You've heard of mitochondria. Mitochondria and chloroplasts, and plants have mitochondria as well, are originally in the evolutionary process were their own organisms. That each, the chloroplasts and the mitochondria, have their own DNA. And they were subsumed, they were taken in by other organisms, and they were given protection. And so, for example, chloroplasts and mitochondria were thought to be something like bacterial type organisms we have now, by having absorbed in single-celled organisms, absorb these little other organisms, smaller ones. And so these smaller ones, like mitochondria, which produce energy, and chloroplasts, which produce food, they end up in a wonderful symbiotic relationship. Everyone benefited. The bigger cell benefited because it got its own food, it got its own energy, and the smaller ones were not being eaten by other things, which are bigger than that. So these, are, like mitochondria, are very, very ancient. But just looking at chloroplasts, they have a couple of membranes, and they have these things called thylakoids, and they're like coins, and a stack of these thylakoids are called grana, one granum, and they're within the stroma, which is like a bubble, if you like, just a liquid. And they have within the grana a large number of chlorophyll molecules, and therefore they can produce their glucose, which then goes into the plant, that whatever it has to do. So if so we have the chlorophyll. Now, they also have their own DNA, so they can reproduce themselves within the leaf or within the stem or wherever they're found. And mitochondria can also reproduce themselves. So if, for example, if you are a person who wants to take up athletics, weightlifting, or something like that, where you're using muscles that you don't normally use much of, the muscles will need more energy, ATP. So you increase the number of mitochondria. You don't do it willingly. Mitochondria just reproduce themselves because they've got their own DNA. And of course, you've heard about mitochondrial DNA with respect to genealogy. If you haven't, I can tell you about that too. So, so this DNA, and by the way, in mitochondria is always passed down through the mother's line in animals. But that's another story. Have a look at this down the bottom here. Now, photosynthesis, we said carbon dioxide and water, with energy coming in, produces glucose and oxygen. Now, under aerobic respiration, that's how we, as animals, survive. Our metabolic process is the reverse. Look at this. We take the glucose, we use the oxygen, we breathe in, we produce carbon dioxide, which we breathe out, we produce water, which we use, and energy in the form of ATP, and we can do things. And so we rely on each other. Now, of course, a plant has both of these. So in the leaves, it does this. In the rest of the plant, it does that. Amazing. Now, the DNA codes for the enzymes that are actually required in the photosynthetic process. Here's another diagram, a bit more complicated. I won't go into too much detail, but there are two reactions, two sets of reactions. One's called the light reaction and one's called the dark reaction. And now the dark reaction word is not used here, but so in the light reaction, the light comes in, and here the grana. The water is converted to, the oxygen in the water is put together into O2, which is the oxygen that we breathe. What's left moves across to this, what's called the dark reaction. It's called the dark reaction because it does not require light. Not that it happens in the dark, it just doesn't need the light. And goes through this cycle, Krebs cycle, and it produces, no, it's not the Krebs, Kelvin cycle. And it produces the sugar that it exports. Okay, so it's a very complicated system. I'm not going to go to chemistry again, but I'd like you to notice here that here you've got starch to storage. It also can be converted to amino acids in the plant. It can also be converted to fatty acids in the plant. So if you have a seed, if you like nuts, you have this fat in them, the amino acids in the proteins and the starch in them. Ooh. So chlorophyll and carotenoids, they're different pigments. Okay, in chlorophyll, they respond to different wavelengths of light. That's the important thing. Visible light. So there's lots of light that's not visible. So in chlorophyll, it's the main pigment in photosynthesis. And it reflects green light and it absorbs the red and the blue most strongly. So the reason that we see plants outside, looking at one there, the leaves are green, is because it doesn't use the light, it reflects the light off the leaf. The reds and the blues are absorbed, and that's what's used in photosynthesis. The carotenoids are the pigments like algae and photosynthetic bacteria, and the yellow, red, orange, various colors, and the vegetables like the orange vegetables, the reds, and they use, these are the names for them. But the algae use the carotenoids for photosynthesis. And in us, these carotenoids, so these colored vegetables and fruits, are really useful for us as antioxidants. So eat plenty of colorful vegetables and fruit. So I put this in to show you there are two chlorophylls, A and B, and they really absorb light in this blue range, including the carotenoids, and absorb a little bit more in the red range, but not in the green and not the yellow. Does that make sense? I don't know.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. I can see four of you, so no one's nodding, so I'm not sure. Okay, now there are hormones. The plant produces hormones like we do, and these are some hormones, but they have multiple functions. And some of these hormones are the auxins, and there's abscisic acid, and ethylene. I only mentioned three. There are a couple of others. So the auxins, they were the first plant hormones which were discovered. Not that Charles Darwin discovered them, but he dabbled in plant hormone research very early on. Now, Charles Darwin was around mid-1800s, and he had a wonderful brain. He just kept thinking about living things in different ways. So what do auxins do? They stimulate cell elongation. This is in plants. So they become longer, taller. They stimulate cell division in the cambium. So with a hormone called cytokinins, they can either become, as I said before, the xylem or the phloem. They differentiate. They stimulate, here we are, differentiation, and they stimulate root initiation on stem cuttings. So if you take a geranium, it's very easy to grow a new geranium plant. You can break a little bit off, stick it in some soil or in a bit of water. It's the auxins that will start initiating roots to grow from the cut bit, and you can see them. In tissue culture, there are also lateral root developments as well, but that's another story. Now, they also mediate tropistic response. So, for example, a tropism is the movement towards something. So it could be a movement towards light. So plants will move towards light. That's called phototropism. The other one is geotropism, moving towards earth. Oxygen supply from the apical buds. Now, the apical buds, so when a plant grows, the apex buds, where the growth is, oxygens are produced there. And as it's growing, it suppresses lateral buds moving out. So it wants to go as high as it can. Depends if it's in the shade or the situation, but it's a generalization. But it does suppress that growth. It also delays leaf senescence. That means the deterioration with age, and just you've got to imagine a closed bracket there. It seems to have fallen off. Now, the leaf senescence is when a green leaf eventually, the plant extracts everything out of the leaf and becomes all the goodies are gone, and then becomes brown, and then they seal off the bit where the leaf attaches to the stem, and then it falls down. So if a plant needs as much food in the growth period as it can, it'll delay this process of dying of the leaf. It can inhibit or promote leaf and fruit abscission. and using the, ethylene as it's a gas which it produces. So abscission is, there's more detail coming, but basically when a leaf is dead, abscission is when it separates from the tree or the plant and drops to the ground. The same with fruit, same with flowers. It just is producing that. This is just this process. You'll see in a second. So oxygen is also induced fruit setting and also growth in some plants. Different plants have different mechanisms, and it promotes flowering in bromeliads. You know, bromeliads are plants that store water, like in a little dam down the bottom. It stimulates growth of flower plants. It stimulates the production of ethylene at high concentrations. So ethylene, it's only got 4 atoms in it, 2 carbons and 2 hydrogens. For those who might remember your chemistry, it's the 2 carbons are linked by a double bond and a hydrogen each end. So here's a very famous experiment, very, very famous, from the late 1800s. Here's a plant, whatever an avena is, I don't know, but a seed has germinated, the coleoptile comes up, and they cut off the tip, the stem tip. They have a piece of agar. Now, agar is a type of jelly made from seaweed, which we use a lot in labs, you know, for growing bacteria or whatever. It's just a form of very special jelly, and they put the tip, the apical tip, on top of the agar, let it sit for a little bit on the agar, then put the agar without the tip on the cut stem, and it grows, because something, this is the key to it, something has moved from the tip into the agar and caused the plant to grow. So then some bright spark did the same experiment, but a little bit differently, put the agar, we only talk about something a millimeter or 2 or 3 across, on the halfway across. So whatever's in there only went down one side, and it grew with a curve. So there was very strong evidence, very strong proof that the tip of the growing shoot is producing some chemical that causes the extension and growth of the stems. So, this it helped explain the idea of phototropism. Now, photo means light, tropism means moving towards the light. So a plant moves toward, in this case, it bends towards the light. Now the other one, roots grow towards gravity. So that's called geotropism. Earth tropic movement is towards anything. Okay, so we have these two things which oxygens are very important in. So how does this work? You have a little pot plant, if you like, on the windowsill, and it then bends towards the light. Now the terminal or apical bud up here, if the light is all around, it will just go straight up. But if the light comes from one side, the the cells away from the light will elongate, become longer than on this side. And so it bends towards the light so you can photosynthesize. So, so it seems that the light actually affects the oxygen here. So it prevents the extension of the cells, the elongation. So this is positive because it grows towards light. It's called positive phototropism. And because it grows away from gravity, we say it's negative geotropism. So with the root, we have the root growing down that way. So we have positive geotropism, so it grows towards gravity, and negative phototropism, away from the light. Now, you see this IAA here, it stands for indole acetic acid. It's a form of oxygen. There are a small number of groups in that called oxygens. So what happens here is the oxygen in the root accumulates down the bottom, and it just grows down towards the gravity. If the root grows sideways, then it causes it accumulates here and causes the same as here, less growth. So it bends down towards light, gravity. There's another type of tropism called thigmotropism. So if you've seen plants with tendrils or roots that wind around something, the thigmo is the touching. That's it. So it's thigmo by touching. So it actually grows. So by touching, the oxygens are increased, which reduce the size, the length of these cells on the inside. And then the outside cells grow longer and just goes around and around. So things like peas and beans and so on. And so when so the tendrils or the roots touches the support, the cells produce the oxygens which inhibit the elongation, which is what I said. So it's in the cells on the other side of the plant, of the stem, they elongate under normal oxygen activity, and so you get this curling effect. Another hormone called abscisic acid. I mentioned abscission before, and it's only 1963, so it's not that long ago that they discovered it, and they were looking at what controlled fruit and leaf abscission. Why did fruit drop? Why did leaves drop? And it's known as the plant stress hormone. So when a plant is under stress, like water stress, it will produce a lot of this abscisic acid and drop a lot of leaves. So the more leaves it drops, the less water it loses. So other functions that abscisic acid has, it stimulates the closure of stomata. So if too much water is lost when the stomata are open, it'll close them to reduce water loss. Now, it sounds like there's a little brain in there in the plant working like an ours. Well, there are signal systems in the plant, like us. If we need to sweat, we don't think we need to sweat. It happens. The brain does it. They don't have a brain, they've got other systems though. It's amazing. So abscisic acid also induces seeds to synthesize storage proteins. This is within the seed. And they all have some effect on the induction and maintenance of dormancy. Now, dormancy is when a seed is dormant, meaning nothing happens until the right conditions for it arrive somehow by us planting it, or the rain comes, or whatever it might be. And then the abscisic acid is washed away, and then dormancy is stopped, and the plant starts to grow. Now, this ethylene, discovered in 1917, and is very, very, very important. As I said, it's tiny. It's a tiny, tiny gas molecule. So fruit ripening, flower opening, the release of dormancy, shoot and root growth and differentiation, leaf and fruit abscission. It's involved in that. I mentioned before, bromeliad flower induction, and flower and leaf senescence. So the end of life of a leaf or flower that becomes old. And the ethylene is very well known for the stimulation of the ripening of fruit. So in the banana industry, where's my banana picture? I think the banana industry, it uses bags, plastic bags, to contain the gas, and so they can control the timing of the banana ripening. So, and also, if you have unripe fruit in a bowl, if you put an apple or a banana, especially bananas produce a lot of ethylene, the ethylene around the fruit will help the ripening process. Here are bananas. Okay, so they put these bags around. Bananas start ripening from the end, from the bottom, from the far end. And by having the plastic bag around them, the plastic bag fills with the ethylene, and this helps with the ripening. Now, there are three types of plants, what are called long day plants, short day plants, and day neutral plants. So a long day plant will flower when there's about 12 hours of light. A short day plant is when it's about 12 hours of no, that can't be right. On 6 is that right? 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. is 12 hours, yeah. So it must be more. When there's more light, than dark, the long days, and the more dark than light, it's a short day plant, and other plants don't matter. So like the roses. So poinsettias are short day plants that will flower in winter. The carnations will flower in summer. I don't know if you knew that. Why this? Now, it's found with short day plants that require a long night. If you shine a very bright light on a plant, such a plant, around the time it's about to flower, it will not flower because it somehow senses the light, and somehow, I don't know how that works, but that will not flower then for another year. So we have a classification of plants based on their photoperiodism. Photo is light, and the period of, well, so a short day plant, which is less than 12 hours, long day more than 12 hours, and day neutral is anything. Doesn't matter how long. So we have this responses, and give you some examples here. So, well, you know that some of your plants in the garden will flower in winter, some will flower in spring, some in summer. Now, I want to show you these now, but go back and have a look at these. These are 3 videos, and give you the link about the hormones, about auxins and gibberellins. I haven't even mentioned gibberellins yet, and the regulators and the plant hormones. So now plants adapt. They wherever they are. If they can't adapt, they die. So they're everywhere in the world except Antarctica. I think they've got some lichen down there, but lichen are not your normal plant. They're a combination of fungus and alga. The alga live inside the fungus. Now, I picked one because we were talking so much about water. I picked some examples of what sort of adaptations are that plants have developed to reduce water loss in arid conditions. They can have hairy leaves or hairy stems. Now, when you've got a lot of little hairs, water is actually trapped within the hairs. And then you can actually have stomata that open below that. And if you've got, say, a high concentration of water trapped within the hairs, the plant will not lose any extra water. They have sunken stomata where, I'll show a diagram, where the stomata are not at the surface but hidden, they're sunken, so they don't, water loss is reduced. They photosynthesize at dawn and dusk, as I mentioned, in very arid areas, again, to reduce water loss. The curling of leaves where the stomata are within the curl, so that reduces water loss. They actually store water. They have developed thick, waxy cuticles on their leaves to stop water loss through just generally through the surface without anything being open. And there are leaves that track the sun to reduce overheating. So, for example, you've got in Central Australia, where they've got gum trees that the leaves hang down, and the edge of the leaf in the morning faces the sun, and as the sun tracks across, the leaf turns, so the edge of the leaf always follows the sun. Minimum exposure of sun on the leaf. And then after sundown, the leaf slowly rotates back to its original position, ready for the next morning. And then, of course, we have deciduous trees. Now, we have no natural deciduous trees in Australia because we don't have those cold winters where there is no free water in the soil. So when you've got snow, the water in the soil becomes ice. And if you have ice, there's no free water. So the plants can't get water. Here's a plant, a cactus, very, very hairy, and that actually holds a fair bit of water in there. If there's a wind, it'll blow it away, but under normal conditions, it will be fine. Here are sunken stomata. So there's a cuticle, and there are the guard cells, and their water exchanges through here. So it's a little bit of gap there for to get the carbon dioxide will flow in anywhere, and the oxygen will flow out, but it minimizes water flow. And here's the diagram of the curved leaf. So the stomata are on the inside. These little purple dots indicate that. And again, this area here would be fairly humid, but the area here is small and it would lose very little water. Here's the baobab tree, which actually stores water. And Aborigines knew how to access that water. That's a very old one, by the way. So, guys, that's it simply. there are complications along the way, but I hope you got something out of that. It's quite complicated, and I try to keep it simple. Try to keep the chemistry as simple as I can.
Ruben?
Yep.
I probably watched that 14 times, but I want to tell you, not one of them is the same.
It's not.
Not one of them. And I congratulate you. And I know that you're keeping it short.
Yeah.
In other words, there's a lot more to talk about.
Yeah, it's the hard part is deciding what to produce, to give you and what not to give you.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well done, Ruben. It was interesting.
Thank you, Basil, and welcome back to the land of the living.
Oh, you're right about that.
Shows it's not only the human body so complicated.
Oh no!
Amazing.
This is why. That is exactly what I wanted you to realize. The plants out there, even though you give them a bit of water, a bit of feeding or something or other, they are extremely complex systems, which are much older than animal systems, much older.
I shall respect the plants much more. I will.
You should. Yes.
I will. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's no problem of pruning it to help it grow. There are things you can do, but it's all good. It's all good.
Amazing.
Can I ask you a question, Ruben?
Anything, Peter?
All right. This new NASA telescope, the James Webb Telescope.
Okay.
I believe that when it looks at exoplanets,
Yes.
it may be able to identify those which have got oxygen on them. Do you know if this is correct?
What about identifying planet or identifying the oxygen?
No, by looking at the planet and the atmosphere in the planet,
yes,
it can identify if the planet has got oxygen.
Well, every substance, every gas, for example, has got its own signature frequency. Yeah, when light goes through it.
But that would be an indication that there would be life on that planet, wouldn't it?
Yes, but it also has to pick up water.
Oh yes.
So you could have an atmosphere. I'm trying to think. Mars has got a little bit of an atmosphere, but it's very high in carbon dioxide. So I can't remember now, but it has very little oxygen. So you may develop some organism that can produce its own energy or its own metabolize itself using whatever gases are available. But it has to be able to, I mean, we know what we have on Earth. Trying to extrapolate what's somewhere else with, whatever gas, whatever liquid, whatever is there, what sort of organisms would develop. It's possible. But I don't know. I'm not a science fiction writer. I don't have that imagination. And
no, this is science fact.
I know. But you need to have that imagination to think of what could be out there.
Oh yeah, there'll be all sorts of creatures out there.
Say that again. But don't forget, it also have to have enough light. And so if it can't be too close to the star, it can't be too far from the star. So where the Earth is the Goldilocks orbit. not too hot, not too cool, just right.
Yes, that's where water is
Where
liquid.
the water is, yeah.
Yeah.
And our system uses water. There may be other systems which we know nothing about, which may not use water. They may use, I don't know, ammonia. Who knows? I don't know. Good question, though.
Yeah.
But it's called James Wells Telescope, isn't it? Something like
James Webb.
yeah. It's an amazing human development. If you can go onto the NASA website, they've got lots of photos. Fantastic. And now, the other thing is, I'll tell you now, I'll send an email later that in a few days we're going traveling, so I'll be away for 2 weeks. So today fortnight will not be a lesson. You're more than welcome to try, but I won't be here.
We can look up some of your old ones.
Well, they'll be up there. Yeah, I've got about 20 of them on YouTube now, I think.
Oh, yes.
And so this is the next one. So it's recording. I will I chop this bit out. And by the way, even though I can see all your names on the recording, the names are not there. Just if you're worried about security or something.
They're all anonymous except for photo recognition.
So there must be a. We're not in China.
No, but we've got Bunnings here.
Oh yes, okay. That's okay. So if there are no other questions, I bid you farewell.
And we wish you a happy holiday.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Robert. And
You deserve it.
thank you. And I'll see you in 4 weeks.
In 4 weeks.
And have a happy holiday.
Thank you.
All the
Great.
best. Take
Thank
care.
you.
Thank you.
See you, Ruben. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.